Buenas tardes, muy bienvenido. I hope you all had a nice cup of coffee. I hope you all enjoyed the posters. And I'm glad that you're all here. And so we have this, what we hope, a very exciting session on a debate, in fact, panel debate, on the importance of secondary forest in restoration and biological conservation. And I'm Frans Bongers, and I have the honor to be introducing these persons here and to introduce the topic to all of you. And you know the system now. So get your mic, your telephones, get your ready to answer questions. So this is the topic of today. It's a topic is proposed by Dr. Miguel Martinez and Dr. Robin Chazdon from Partners Group and from ATBC together and from the University of Morelia in Mexico, UNAM in Mexico. The topic is the role of secondary forests in conservation and restoration. And when we think about it, and we have very little time to do introductions because they are going to do all the details. So then we think about this, forest transition. And everybody has seen this figure at some point in their careers, I hope. So this is about the general decrease of forest cover in any country in the world that is going down. And at some point there is what is called the transition point. So it's going down, and all of a sudden, countries or regions realize that maybe that's too low, and maybe we need some of these services that forests provide, and then it starts to increase again. And there are several ways of this increase. It can be done through various ways, and at that moment we talk about conservation and restoration. So conservation is very much, in the view of many people, very much related to the view of old growth forests have to be conserved. Maybe we should also think about other forests that have to be conserved. That's another point. They will come back to that one. The second word here is restoration, and that is connected to what is happening after the transition point. And so maybe there is also something we can think about, that restoration is connected to the first part, to decrease old growth forest, we can do restoration to prevent further decrease. So that's on the left-hand side of the curve. And I'm so happy that the person who came up with this story, Tom Rudel, he's here in the panel. So we are very happy to hear his views later on. So there are several opportunities for the future. We can think in terms of secondary forests, we can think in terms of plantations, natural regeneration, silvopastoral systems, managed forest. We can think about novel ecosystems, completely new systems that have never existed before and that come to place because or people make them, or they are the results of new combinations of factors that together bring new combinations of plants and animals and interactions that together make new systems. And then I ask myself, where are we on the curve? And maybe all of you should ask yourself, where are you or your side or your area or your country on this curve? Is it on the left-hand side? Is it on the right-hand side? Where is it going? And if we think about where it's going, it's about the future. And the future is something that we want, that we seek for, that we want to make together for ourselves, for our children, for our grandchildren. That's the future. And we have to think about the future, and then we have to think about how we want to get there. How do we do this? And if I look only at that picture, and I think in all the elements that come to my mind, biodiversity, conservation, land abandonment, institutions, incentives, livelihood, planting trees, doing things, exotic species, opportunity disturbance, diversity, and many more. So, laws. We have heard quite a few presentations today and other days and probably also tomorrow on these issues. For me, this is daunting. I get afraid if I see it. So if there are so many factors involved, I'm not sure how to deal with that. But then we have, of course, that's why we have these panel persons. Yeah? So we have 5 specialists, 5 experts with a lot of experience. They are going to enlighten us a little bit. A little bit. Yeah? And so before we do that, we have our system, the audience questions. We have 2 audience questions, and they come up now. So get your telephones. You have it all installed, just like this morning and yesterday. And the first question is, should secondary forest fragments be protected as conservation areas in regions with low forest cover and little primary forest remaining? Should we do that? Well, the question is that possible or not? Eh? That's one question. So, I'm now voting for B. Come on, B, come on. Oh, B is done? Is the time up? We go for the next question? Oh, it's still running, it's still running. So, who is B? Come on, B. I mean, we want... If too many people say yes there, it's boring. So then the panelists have to defend why it's B. Yeah? So be prepared. Eh? Okay, go. So this helps. So we have like another 50, 20, 30 seconds. Or is this question 2 already? Oh, I can see this here. Eh? Okay. So people tend to think yes, no questions. That's okay. In most cases, we think about yes, but, and no, unless, and it all depends. That's what we ecologists are trained for. It all depends. But sometimes you have to make choices in life. Yeah? So now, 20% said, no way, forget about these secondary forest fragments in these poor areas. Okay? We have another 15 seconds, and then the second story comes up. The second question comes up. Is that correct? 97. It's going down. Okay. So we have 66 people now that are voted. There are more than 66 people. Who is hiding out there? Are there people without a cell phone? Can you please stand up and say that I don't have a cell phone? No? No button. Okay. Okay, then we go for the second question. So the second question. Here also you have to make choices in life. You cannot say yes, both is important, etc. No. What dimension is relatively more important for conserving biodiversity in secondary forest? You have to make choices here. Do you think biophysical aspects are more important in conserving biodiversity? Or is it the socioeconomic aspects? Which of these 2 is more important? And, yeah? So yes, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but that's not the option. So think about the area that you know best, where you think, in my area, this is A and the other. Does natural forest regenerate? Oh. Hey, there is a misunderstanding here. Yeah, but it's okay. Yes means biophysical elements are most important. Oh, do you have another question? Ah, okay. I'm sorry. So, well, this is just part of a dynamic panel meeting. Eh? So, is this something that we're going to solve, or we just go? I don't know. Really? So my fault? Okay, my fault. Sorry. No. That's fine. I mean, I'm very sorry. So we have only one question then. Yeah? Okay. So, the panel. We have 5 persons. Here they are. Robin Chazdon, Manuel Guariguata, Laura Schneider, Bernardo Strasbourg, and Tom Rudel. And I'm going to introduce each of them a little bit. So maybe let's start with Robin. Robin Chazdon. I think yes, everybody knows her. So I should not say anything, but I still will. Because here's Robin coming. Robin loves the forest. And Robin was in the forest some time ago, maybe when I met her for the first time in Mexico, in fact, in Los Tuxtlas. So that's like in the early 80s. You don't want to know this. Okay. And then at that time, she was completely addicted to light measurements and palms. That's the things she was doing. She loved that. And then in 1996, she was part of the editorial team of this fantastic book, Tropical Forest Plants and Ecophysiology. A completely different Robin than we know today, a little bit, I would say. So there is some changes here. And her topics are successional pathways, vegetation dynamics, functional ecology of trees in new tropical forest. That's what she does. And then in 2001, there is this another fantastic book, Foundations of Tropical Forest Biology, which I really like. And I would like all students to read this book. This is a compilation of the classics with comments. It's really interesting. All the things you don't find anymore because it's like more than 20 years ago or 30 years ago, but they're still very important today. So read them. And of course, here on the right-hand side, I say the godmother of second growth. Well, that's what Robin at the moment is. And that's for sure after this seminal book, Second Growth, that half of the audience will have. And I think it's really great. And there is also like a translation or a reworking or something like that in Spanish in 2016. Huh? Portuguese? Yeah, sorry, yeah, of course. Yeah. Sorry. ATB president, okay, who didn't know that? ATBC director. Biotropica editor. So if there is one person who is for the last decades connected to this organization, it's Robin. And I would like to mention Partners Group, where she is now making this transition from a research person to a more applied person, and she left the University of Connecticut, and she is now connected to 3 other organizations. University of Sunshine Coast, an institute in Rio de Janeiro, Resilience Institute, and the World Resource Institute. And that is all because that's what you want to do now, landscape restoration. And then last but not least, 2 kids, 1 dog. You didn't know this, the 1 dog. So, Robin, the next person is Manuel Guariguata. He is from Venezuela, and I like this because I started my tropical career in Venezuela for half a year. So I have connection here with Manuel. He did an MSc in Florida, PhD in forestry in Yale, and he worked in CATI, UNEP, and CIFOR. And so for the last 10 years or more, he worked with CIFOR, and he is now, if I understand well, the big Latin American CIFOR boss. Yeah? He's a forest ecologist, but now super SES. And SES is Socio-Ecological Systems person. But he works a lot in restoration, forestry, and plantations as well. And I could not avoid mentioning this paper, Neotropical Secondary Succession, which is maybe the most cited paper in this field at the moment. It's like over 1,000 citations, and it still has a lot of impact. So, the famous book Bosques, I would say read it in Spanish. And Manuel loves beer. So this is Panama beer, but he told me that some other beers would be fine as well. You see here the nice black beard. And he is a very cool guy. So here he's fighting with crocodiles. He is really cool. So, and he has 3 kids. Manuel, Laura, Schneider. She is an associate professor at the University of Rutgers in geography. She's from Colombia, but she's fully gringa now, but working in Mexico. Come back to that one. and she has her PhD from Clark University. And her work is on how socio-ecological systems affect patterns and processes of land use cover change. Well, in the beginning, she was a research assistant, like in 1990, that's 25, I repeat this, 25 years ago, she was a research assistant with Manuel Guariguata in the forest. So, and she told me he was already a nice guy at that time. But the last 16 years, she works in Mexico, Yucatan, and this, you see the smile here on her face? Very happily so. She said, don't forget to mention Yucatan. So she said, in fact, I'm at home here. Yes, she's gringa, but she's at home here. Understanding tropical forest resilience after disturbances, remote sensing, biophysical, all kinds of interesting things. And then, she's a Fulbright professor at the University of Columbia. So she's going to Columbia for a year. She loves literature. Cien Años de Solitud, that's her favorite book. And she has one child. Bernardo. He says he's an economist, but he did his PhD in environmental sciences, University of East Anglia. And he is director of the Resilience Institute in Rio de Janeiro, and he is a professor at the University of Rio de Janeiro. And these are his topics: resilience, Cerrado. There was just a recent very cool paper in Nature or Nature Communications, one of these papers on this Cerrado and policy issues. Economics and sustainable resource use, that's what he does. He likes talking with hands and feet, he likes talking. But he likes smiling as well. And if you think this is a person who is talking only, no, he likes foresting. That's a new verb, foresting. And so then, there's two things. No kids, 2 dogs, and they are named after Lord of the Rings. And he is an active gamer, a gamer junk. You mean, we talk about these kids of 16 who are in these cities or doing all these games. He loves this. Yeah, that's good. No, that's good. Tom Rudel. So, Princeton, Yale, Rutgers. Well, that sounds quite okay to me, yeah? Policy, social, people. That's what he does. That's the general thing. He's a geographer as well. And he wrote a number of very influential books. Here one in 1989, here on tropical deforestation, 1993. Here another one on tropical forests and deforestation and these transitional things, 2005. And then another one in 2013. So he just keeps on going. And he got lots of prizes for these books, and there's all for good reasons. And I would say Tom is the godfather of forest transition. And that's related to his paper the graph that I showed in 2005. Also like over 1,000 citations, and it's a really cool paper. It changed the way I looked at forests, so I can tell you that. And one interesting thing, he is now standing here somewhere in Ecuador, and he told me that this is the area where he was working, I'm not saying this, but it's a few decades ago as a Peace Corps volunteer. He cut down the forest by then, and he's now ever after looking what's happening in this area, which is quite interesting. One child, no dogs. So these are the 5 people. These are the topics they're going to talk about. You have all between 5 and 8 minutes, and they hope they get 8, I think. Eh? So Robin, they're going to introduce the questions themselves, where they're going to talk about, and then we come back with other questions. I think.
Okay. So, can you put on my presentation, please? Great. Thank you, Frans, for entertaining us all. Okay. Okay, great. So, I'm going to talk about this question: to what extent does second growth forest represent an option for conserving biodiversity in human modified landscapes? I think this is a really important question that we should be asking in countries all around the world. But in order to answer this question, I really have to answer another question right back, which is an option compared to what other options? Because we're not evaluating this in a vacuum. And it's very important to realize that there are many different ways in which land use can go. And if you're comparing a second growth forest to a pasture, to a cattle pasture, it could have tremendously better opportunities for biodiversity conservation. But if you're comparing it to an old growth forest that has been very well conserved, it comes up pretty short. So I think it's kind of like a glass half empty, half full question. And what are you, when you're assessing the opportunities for conservation in second growth forests, the context is critical. So second growth is one of the options for degraded and deforested land. But there are other options. That land can become further degraded. That land can be used to increase agricultural production through ecological intensification or agroforestry. That land can be used for active reforestation or restoration plantings. And that land can also go into natural regeneration or second growth. And each of these options has different consequences for biodiversity conservation. The lowest one would be further degradation. There's essentially no opportunity for biodiversity. And then we go increasing conservation value as we go to agroforestry, active restoration, reforestation, and natural regeneration. At least this is the way I think about it. But there's a lot of question regarding which is the better option for restoring forests. Should we let it grow naturally, or should we plant? And there's really very little direct comparisons of these. So I wanted to show you some recent results from a study in Sao Paulo State in Brazil. And this is now in revision in ecological applications. We made comparisons between in second growth forests and in planted restoration forests that are between 7 and 20 years old, and looked at the abundance of larger trees, the abundance of small trees, and the abundance of saplings, woody saplings in these sites. These include secondary forests on pasture land, secondary forests in abandoned eucalyptus plantations, agricultural land, and planted forests, multi-species plantings of native trees. And these are reference forests that are a proxy for a mature forest in the area. The main point here is that it depends on which size class you're looking at in terms of which one has the greatest density of trees. So there's more trees in the planted forest because they were put there, but there are very few saplings. There's very little regeneration in this site. They're very remote. And where you find most of the regeneration in this landscape is in these second growth forests. So if you're looking at the future of these forests, these are the ones that are going to be where biodiversity is going to be. So this is just some pictures of these sites. This is the planted area. And this is in an abandoned eucalyptus plantation. And that's the pasture. If you look at the species richness, you also see this flip. In the trees above 5 centimeters, sorry, everyone does that. Trees above 5 centimeters have a higher richness of native tree species in the old growth reference forest and in the mixed tree plantings because a very large diversity of trees were planted. But when you look at the smaller size class, we couldn't even plot the mixed tree plantings because there weren't enough trees to put on this graph. And the second growth in pastures had the highest diversity of native tree species coming up in it, in this smaller size class. So the potential, it matters what size class you're looking at and what context. The landscape context is also hugely important. These are two regions, two states of Mexico that vary tremendously in their land use and remnant native vegetation. In Oaxaca, there's still over 60% of native forests remaining, whereas in Tabasco, it's about 10%. So the opportunities for natural regeneration are going to be very different in these two different scenarios. The land use in the site matters hugely as well to the potential of secondary forests to conserve biodiversity. And this is a gradient here of intensification with increasing inputs and mechanization and disturbance of soil as you go from here towards the right. And with each of these successive severities of land use, there are implications for the amount of time that recovery will take, the kinds of biodiversity and ecosystem services that you'll find, the extent to which we'll have weed and invasive species problems, and the costs associated with restoration as well. So all of these factors go into the question about the conservation of biodiversity. And natural regeneration really falls, it will depend very much on what that previous use was. Another point I'd like to make is that we tend to emphasize local diversity, or what we call alpha diversity, in making these comparisons of biodiversity options. And this is a study done in Pará State, Brazil, where they looked at alpha diversity in a variety of different forest types, from unlogged forest here on the left, logged forest, logged and burned forest, and second growth forest here, pasture and agriculture. And so I've highlighted the second growth forest here. This is standardized species richness and at the site level, and you can see it's lower in second growth forests, and people point this out all the time. There aren't as many species in second growth forests as you tend to find in an older forest. But there's a lot more than in the pastures and agriculture. And let me just go on. These are also, on the bottom, this is gamma diversity. So this is landscape level species diversity. And as you can see here, the differences aren't as great as they are at the local site level. And that is because of beta diversity, or the turnover of species composition from one site to another, or from one landscape to another. And in this case, it turns out that the secondary forests have very high beta diversity. So this kind of heterogeneity does contribute to biodiversity conservation at the landscape scale and above. So in conclusion, many considerations make a difference in determining the biodiversity options for second growth forests, including the kind of land use and what the alternatives are in that region. The taxa that you compare and the size classes also matter, and the landscape and regional context matters hugely. Prior land use matters, and time. If you evaluate a secondary forest only 5 years into its regeneration, you're not going to find as many species as you will 25 years later. And also, I think we've overrated the importance of alpha diversity, and beta and gamma diversity really matter in this context because of the importance of heterogeneity for resilience. So we need all kinds of forests in our landscapes to really protect biodiversity.
Thank you very much, Roman. Thank you. Manuel,
Thank you.
Guariguata.
Thank you, Frans, for the introduction as well.
8 minutes.
There you go. You go this way? Nope. Can you restart it? It's not slide 1. Yeah, but it's not the first slide.
Well, just go back. Oh.
It's like the map. Yeah? Good. Thanks very much. Thanks for the invitation, and I hope to give you a crash course on governance of forest, secondary forest as a tool for large-scale restoration. Sorry. So there are three pillars of forest governance. This is governance 101. Just to put everything in context, though, you'll be able to understand what I'm trying to say in a few minutes. There's policy, legal, institutional, and regulatory frameworks, both within and outside the forest sector, which affect the permanence of a given secondary forest patch. It also involves planning and decision-making process, whether it's inclusive, exclusive, confined to an elite, participatory or not. And we have implementation, enforcement, and compliance, whether it's legitimate, it follows the rules, etc. Beyond that, we have a few key variables, which I hope will further help you to understand what I'm going to say later and the examples that I'm going to highlight. These are the key variables of so-called good forest governance. You need clear user rights and responsibilities from all ends, top and down. Participation by those who depend on forests, this is critical. Accountability of both users and decision makers. Monitoring of management outcomes, this is also very critical. Enforcement of property rights and institutional capacities. And what you see on the right is that these key variables are probably well established, but not all the time they work perfectly from the top to the bottom and vice versa. It can be a perfect law or a nearly perfect law or decree in the capital, and when you go down locally, it really has no effect or is disregarded by whatever reason, and vice versa. Okay, it can work very well at the local side, but there are discrepancies and actions that can be taken in the capital. So this issue of multi-level connectivity, it's an important part of the picture of how forests are governed from the top to the bottom. So I'm just going to give some examples that are not necessarily comprehensive, but I hope will give you an idea of what are the main constraints for secondary vegetation to persist or not in a landscape just like this, which is a mosaic of agriculture, some secondary forest, some patches of perhaps old-growth forest, roads, and houses. So I'm going to start with Peru. It's very clear that agricultural and environmental benefits of secondary forests are politically divorced. There's a very inherent and permanent tension between the ministries of agriculture and the Ministry of Environment. Land use planning falls under the Ministry of Environment, yet the Ministry of Agriculture governs land use change by issuing titles and permits. So at the end, they have the last word whether a 20-year-old secondary forest is going to stay or not. So then the Ministry of Environment has little leverage to support secondary forest conservation. Let's take the example of red. If a given secondary forest patch reaches a minimum age or size, even though red, which is payments for environmental services via carbon, it's in the hands of the Ministry of Environment, they can do very little, or sometimes they can do nothing to maintain this via incentives. So there's a clear example of cross-sectoral divorce, battling over a single resource. Indonesia, and this is not only Indonesia, but Southeast Asia. Forestry agencies largely control what they call degraded forest landscape. Forests that have been logged fall into the secondary forest category, not necessarily the definition we use in the neotropics, which is regrowth after complete clear cutting. And hence they funnel capital subsidies to companies for massive land use change. So again, there's elite capture associated with forestry agencies that have an opinion on what degraded is or not. This is one example in the context of political institutions. Then we go to Ethiopia, where some of you may know that there was a massive program to enhance natural regeneration via exclosures, to exclude cattle, fire, probably other stressors. It is estimated that up to now we have 3 million hectares of naturally regenerated forests in the country in different stages of succession. But the program was very top-down from the beginning, primarily governed by NGOs with support from the government. There was very little local involvement, unclear co-management schemes between the government and the communities, poorly defined user rights, who's going to use what and when and how, and that generated a lot of internal and community conflict across the country. And it ended up being the product of improper planning, which influenced success. Nobody knew exactly when we would stop and say, okay, this is harvestable or not. So this is an example of where a very large area was, it's currently ongoing natural succession, but there are very, very many uncertainties on how exactly to access these resources and how to really make it equitable. Mexico and Costa Rica, this is an example where technocratic prescriptions disregarded local needs, but progress was made. So this is probably an optimistic kind of slide. The top bullet refers to Costa Rica. Up until to Mexico. Up until 2016, a secondary forest needed a management plan when the given patch of vegetation exceeded 4 square meters per hectare of basal area and 15 trees per hectare with diameter larger than 25. In other words, if it was below that threshold, it could be managed or cut freely. However, at that structural, with those structural attributes, that patch of forest was still heavily used by native populations. In other words, it limited traditional harvesting of small diameter trees and non-timber forest products. Now, as we speak, Mexico is reforming its forestry code, and from the paper from which this information was derived has been influential in trying to change these and hence not be that restrictive. In other words, consider the views of local farmers and local landholders. In the second case, it comes from Costa Rica. From 1999 till 2016, timber harvesting was in secondary forest, followed or shall avoid the establishment of monospecific forest stands. In other words, clear cutting was not allowed by the law. Since this year, this has changed and monocyclic systems are allowed. Monocyclic means that you can clear cut, hence you can get a good density of like-demanding trees, which are very useful for local farmers, for poles, for constructions. So, in other words, this is probably the product of what has been discussed in several sessions here in ATVC on the need to really, us researchers, get and go and talk to politicians and write briefs and inform the law, or at least lawmakers, in improving the way these systems should manage from a local perspective. So some thoughts for moving forward. Disaggregate passive restoration, and by passive restoration I mean secondary succession. I think that we tend to, we talk about secondary forests, but there are secondary forests and there are secondary forests like Robin just mentioned. So there are two ways to really think about where we can better intervene or be more effective. When land opportunity costs are low, human use is minimal, or else strict protection is to be applied. That's probably one way of intervening and enhancing the permanence. The other one is when human use is an integral part of the system. What do we do? I think both, they're a little bit different, hence we need to think differently in terms of how exactly researchers are going to intervene in order to try to maintain these resources. Recognize that secondary forests are part of a highly dynamic socio-ecological system, unlikely to be managed either by a single government sector, agriculture, environment, or scientific discipline. So this is a system that needs truly interdisciplinarity. And this also leads to the issue of curricular innovation. I see many instances in which I would like to see forester learning from agronomists and vice versa. And the curricular system in most developing countries where I work in terms of forestry is still very orthodox. So interdisciplinarity, in my opinion, is also key to move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Manuel. I'd like to invite Maria.
Buenas tardes, good afternoon, everybody. Okay, so I want to thank Miguel and Robin for organizing the session, for inviting me. It was really great to participate and talk to all of you and feel close to my biology upbringing, I suppose. The question that was sort of asked to address today was regarding knowledge gaps, and obviously those are tremendous, those are really large, and in no way I'm going to try to be sort of comprehensive here. But before I start to make some of the points that I think they're close to the research that I do on these landscapes of the Yucatan, I want to sort of mention how much work has been done and recently in terms of understanding forest regrowth, forest succession. I mean, we've been seeing in the last maybe 5 years papers in Science, in Nature, just addressing these really critical issues. And not only from you, I mean, here, I think tomorrow there's going to be a great session on secondary forest ecology, so you're all welcome to go there and see some of those results. The work that partners, the organization that Frans mentioned before, that has been actually really great in doing what Manuel just mentioned regarding interdisciplinary research, as bringing social, physical scientists as well as geographers that are interested in sort of spatial stuff. So I think we need to sort of acknowledge that as well as I go through those. And again, what I want to do is not necessarily comprehensive, but is very related to my own work. So I think I need this slide, I think. So these are the 3 points I want to make. First, one of the things that we've been seeing a lot is how critical the forest regrowth is for carbon sequestration and carbon offset. But I think sometimes a lot of the work has been focused on probably old growth forest, and there is less done on secondary growth or second forest growth. So we need really local estimation. So I'm going to just give you an example of a student working here in the Colegio de Postgraduados in Texcoco that is trying to address this issue in the Yucatan, in Quintana Roo. The second point has to do, obviously, being a geographer, the importance of the spatial configuration of landscapes. And I know we spend a lot of time, and I've seen a lot of talks here as well, and within my own discipline, trying to understand how the configuration of the landscape affects disturbances, or what are driving those new configurations. So I think it is important to think not only in one way in terms of what drives those, but also how the configuration of regrowth is due to disturbance and land use especially. And finally, I want to make a point regarding long-term studies in areas where people actually work. And that's really close to me. I've been working in this region for 16 years, and many of the plots that I've been working since I started have been in places where people might just cut all the forest, and then I might be just unlucky and say, oh, okay, oops, I have to start again. But I think it's really critical if we want to understand forest regrowth that we do that. So let's see if I can go through those in 4 minutes and 30 seconds. So this might be of knowledge to you, but I think to me it's really impressive just to see how much reforestation actually can offset carbon emissions. And so this is a map from work a little old in 2011 that shows that between 2000 and 2007, half of the emissions were actually offset by reforestation. And this recent paper that Robin pointed out to me recently, that shows actually that secondary growth has the potential to really offset emissions that have been already done in the last 11 years. So when we think of those, however, we sometimes forget that these estimations are based maybe on estimations of biomass that are based on, maybe you're very familiar with sort of equations that are probably estimating biomass based on big trees, not small trees. So one of the things that I want to show here is how in the Yucatan we have basically very recent forest is the one that dominates the most. This is a work by Marcela Holguín, previously in Conifer, and basically what it shows is that a lot of the area is actually covered by very recently disturbed forests between 0 and 10 years. It takes a lot of the area, and this is in the state of Quintana Roo. So if we think that this is important, so maybe we need to try to develop equations or the estimations of biomass that are related to the species that are actually growing in the region. And this is a work, again, that by Ramiro Puc at Colpost that shows using the most common secondary growth species between 0 and 10 centimeters dBH, and just doing the empirical work and showing how close it gets to the actual estimates in the field, and how far it's from estimations of biomass coming from equations like Hughes or Chavez that are quite common. And so for us, when we are looking, for example, at the effect of a disturbance on biomass, for me it's really important to see how different just having that equation will be in the final estimation. So this is just showing the amount of biomass, above ground biomass, before and after Hurricane Dean in 2007. Here's some of the experiments. So the second thing has to do with the spatial configuration of the landscape. So basically this is work that we've been doing looking at the effect of hurricanes on damage and forest resilience. But one of the things that I want to sort of point out is when you look at disturbance at the landscape level, very aggregated data, this is MODIS, you can see that the damage that occurs is not homogeneous. You don't see a big red spot. This is Dean in 2007, category 5 hurricane. And so I think that this pattern that you see here, it reflects land use and the level of fragmentation that you find in the landscape. So I have a student that look at those things, looking at the difference in terms of how much core and edge exists between agricultural and forestry ejidos. There are different kinds of land use in those communities, and how the fragmentation is actually, in terms of core, significant when we look at wind damage. So these things get to be sort of critical, and I think there is probably less work done on that. And the final point that I want to make has to do with being able to sort of, I will call it monitor, I guess, more than long term, but just being able to work on the landscapes, to do research on landscapes that the people are actually working. If we want to understand that curve, that forest regrowth, forest transition curve that Frans showed at the beginning of the panel presentation, he chose paths, different paths. So you can have a forest that is deforested and it can go back to forest. Or you can have forest that is continuously sort of deforested. So it's kind of much more dynamics. And probably in the at least in the corridor is kind of that dynamic landscape. And so I think that if we want to understand the effects of disturbance, diversity, and other things, we need to make those plots and those parcels in areas where people are actually doing that kind of work. And so I know it's challenging and it requires a lot of work, but I think that that's sort of important. And I think I'm done. So I want to just remind those 3 points again. Estimations of carbon accumulation during forest regrowth need to be scrutinized, and important the spatial configuration and do work on those, what I call working landscapes. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And remember, this is all about Yucatan. That's where we are here now. Eh? So, Bernardo, it's your...
First of all, good evening to everyone, and I'd like to thank the organizers, Manuel, Robbie, for the kind invitation. I'd also like to thank Frans for the kind introduction. Look forward to introducing you next panel. So, what can we learn for policy development from socio-ecological systems thinking? I've been working for the last 4 years with the Ministry of Environment in Brazil, developing what has been just launched as the National Restoration Plan. And we try to include a few lessons from our understanding of socio-ecological systems into that process. I'd like to share some of that with you. So, thinking socio-ecological systems, shamefully stealing from Donella Meadows' thinking systems, also heavily based on a very nice review in Science by Liu et al. A couple of years ago. So our recent understanding as Earth as a large coupled human and natural system with many coupled subsystems linked through time, space, and organizational levels lead us to a set of interconnected, complex, dynamic, adaptive systems. And that's what we're really talking about. Okay, so what? What does that mean for policy potentially? Well, we have a few systems dynamics and properties that are very important, both from ecological but also from a social standpoint, and in particular for the interface between both of them. Resilience, I'll get into details a bit more shortly. Interconnection among multiple objectives, the synergistic interactions and trade-offs, unintended consequences, teleconnections, positive and negative feedbacks, and spillover effects. So that same paper that I mentioned had a very nice table with interesting examples of what we learn from different studies, obviously not going to go to all of them, highlighting 3 about understanding complexity and reducing environmental impacts in distant places and addressing multiple issues simultaneously, all of which highly relevant for policy development in the context of forest restoration. So resilience in particular and its associated concepts of resistance and etc. Has been making the full transition from a systems property discussion at a theoretical level to a policy goal and implementation guidelines. In particular, for example, talking about again second forest regrowth, the importance of understanding socio-ecological production landscapes, the resilience, in particular, the integration of ecological and social resilience. So, of course, for ecologists, the concept of resilience has been around for a bit more, but in social science, it's been taking off in the last few years. But the integration of ecological and social resilience and how one relates to the other is particularly important in the restoration context. Now I'll talk briefly about some research we conducted in the past few years that illustrates some of the other points we've been talking about. So in particular, we've been obsessed a bit about the idea that multiple objectives can be achieved, in particular in the context of biodiversity conservation and climate change mitigation. So we showed a few years ago, not surprisingly, large congruence between biodiversity and biomass in general in forests and other landscapes at the global level, which led us to model that looking for one objective of a policy exclusively target at reducing emissions like RED can have substantial impacts for biodiversity conservation, helping to mitigate up to 90% of projected extinctions worldwide inside forests. So very interesting example of potential synergies among multiple objectives. But illustrating some of the downsides of the same quest for multiple objectives or the consequences for one objective from trying to achieve just a single-minded target policies. In the same work, we highlighted a few areas, as for example the Brazilian Cerrado here in yellow, which showed very high levels of biodiversity, but very low comparative levels of biomass. And at that time, we caught attention to the potential downsides of that, which coupled with very low protection in the Cerrado as compared to the Amazon, led to very large investments in RED in the Amazon, and indirectly to the soybean moratorium, also only applied to the Amazon, coupled with the Brazilian Forest Code that protects the Amazon much more than the Cerrado, potentially led or contributed to, for the first time in Brazil's history, Cerrado deforestation overtook Amazon deforestation in absolute terms. It has always been high in relative terms, but now even in absolute terms, and that's quite striking for a biome that's less than twice the size of the other. And that, which has been partially probably influenced by carbon-focused conservation, has potentially disastrous consequence for biodiversity, as we discussed in the paper that Frans alluded to earlier today. We might be watching episode of mass extinctions of plants in the Cerrado up to 10 times the level of global recorded plant extinctions to date. And to end on a restoration focus exercise we are conducting right now with Robin, Agnieszka, Jean-Paul, and others here present, and I promise to submit next week. It's about the large-scale planning for large-scale restoration, that part of this national plan for restoration, and the quest for multiple objectives, or understanding how multiple objectives can be achieved or not in this context. So if we plan, this is the Brazilian Atlantic rainforest, if we plan for biodiversity conservation, we of course achieve maximum values for biodiversity, very high values for climate. It's very poor in terms of avoiding costs for farmers. It's one of the most expensive solutions or allocations you could get. If you aim for climate, very different allocation, you get middling results for biodiversity and also for cost savings. If you aim for cost savings, you have very high cost savings, but extremely poor performance for both biodiversity and climate. But we can also aim for a multi-criteria, and this allocation, for example, gives you over 80% of all the individual solutions of all the other three goals. So trying to achieve and recognizing the interconnection among the multiple objectives, synergistic interactions, and trade-offs that I alluded to before, and trying to review and manage these trade-offs might help to align with different stakeholders' preferences who are aligned to each of these different goals. And probably in doing that, we are increasing socio-ecological resilience over the long term for the permanence of that restoration. In that same paper, we see how we go from this interconnected system to an integrated policy mix with the goals of reducing habitat loss and restoration in the Cerrado by tapping into several different policies to achieve these goals. And with that, I leave a few take-home messages, and thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Bernardo. Meanwhile, I'm happy to give the floor to Tom Rudel, and meanwhile you can think about your questions. So be prepared that there's time for questions and that you come up with them. Tom.
Okay, so as soon as we get, there we go. So I guess, first of all, I want to thank Robin and Miguel for inviting me. I want to begin with what I think is a relatively odd fact, which is that most secondary forests have, at least historically, been spontaneously generated. In other words, there are two basic sort of paths to secondary forests. One would be through shifting cultivation. A shifting cultivator moves to the next plot, and so you get regrowth on a plot that they just left. The second path involves rural to urban migration. People leave the area where they were farming, and there's regrowth on abandoned agricultural lands. Okay, there's not good evidence on, you could talk in terms of a global forest transition. You could say, well, on net, is there at least something that you could visualize where secondary forests would overtake deforestation and you'd have net forest increase? That was an argument made about 5 years ago. It's seemingly incorrect. If anything, there's an argument out there now, and again, the evidence of the data is poor, but that this process of spontaneous generation of secondary forests is declining. In other words, it's not as robust in as many places as it was maybe 30 or 40 years ago. In part, what this reflects is a slowing of rural to urban migration in places where spontaneous regeneration would occur. Okay, so to some degree, if you talk about how secondary forests have come into being, at least historically, it's been a relatively passive sort of approach. Governments and societies have it's happened, but governments and societies have not played an active role in it. That, I think, is about to change, in part because of the Paris agreements and the countries using their commitments to cutting carbon emissions, using the carbon the sequestered carbon from secondary forests in the tropics as part of that calculus. so to get them to a lower overall rate of carbon emissions. So the question then is, well, how do you get to that kind of situation where, how do governments actually plan secondary forest increase? Well, one prevalent approach is through payment for environmental services, through REDD Plus being an example of this sort of thing. The trouble with REDD Plus is it has significant problems. At least it had encountered its significant problems in the first 5 years of project performances. And that one of the two problems is the absence of secure land tenure over large parts of the global south. In other words, REDD Plus kinds of programs do not work if the recipients of the funds can't demonstrate that they're the owners of a particular piece of land. It's a roadblock. So if you look at, okay, who is it in the global south that actually has secure titles to land? Well, these are people who've cleared most of their land. So for instance, agrarian reform beneficiaries have secure titles to land, but by and large, they've cleared a fair amount of their land. Large landowners have secure titles to land, oftentimes because they've already invested so much in the land there, and getting titles is just another expense. So what this means is that the population of secure title holders aren't people who are likely very good candidates for REDD-like processes. So this is a problem. So the question then is, all right, so what kind of PES focused on secondary forests might work in this connection? So let me just give you an example of this sort of thing, of this kind of project. It's a spontaneously regenerated silvopastoral landscape in a particular locale. So this particular locale is in Ecuador. It's a place I've been doing research for, God, longer than I can remember almost. Here's the setting. The site is right there. Near Macas. It's where the Andes meet the Amazon. It's a waterlogged, luxuriant landscape where new land settlements, where there was a new land settlement scheme occurring in the 1970s. So smallholders in this place have titles to land. Okay, a couple of things to note here. This is a photograph of a recently cleared area in the late 1960s. If you'll note, I don't know if you can see it here. Whoops, back up. This is all cleared land right here. It's clear cut. I mean, there's very, very few trees in the pasture. And there are reasons for that, and we could go into it at some point. This is a shot of the same, not the same exact piece of terrain, but very close to it, 50 years later. And one thing to note is the, well, first of all, these lighter colored areas are stubble created by the cows as they eat their way through the green biomass of the pasture grasses. And so right after the cows have gone through this area, the owners or whoever's managing the cattle will come in with a machete and cut out malezas, or in other words, cut out tree seedlings that are sprouting in these areas. But they're selective in what they cut. They only cut the economically worthless seedlings. So a commercially valuable tree seedling will be allowed to grow, and so you get considerable regeneration over time in these sorts of settings. And you can see the result of that regeneration up here, because you can. There's tree density has increased relatively dramatically in this setting over that 50-year period. Okay, so here you're looking at one of these I guess you could call them quasi-pastures if you wanted to. Anyway, here are the grasses. Though this, by my standards, and I'm not an, I was surprised by the amount of tree biodiversity in those pastures. That when we were surveying in this area, we counted around 120 species of trees. Okay, again, differences between farms in terms of the numbers of trees and pastures, considerably more trees in some farms than in others, and then there's an important question as to why. One of the interesting things is, though, that these pastures begin to generate income for farmers within about 10 years. Okay? So in other words, there's a stream of income that come to farmers that engage in silvopastoral kinds of routines. The other important point here is that the predominant pasture grass in the area is a shade-tolerant grass. So the stocking rate of cattle does not decline when the canopy cover increases. So when you actually do the carbon accounting here, it turns out that the silvopastoral landscapes end up accumulating about a ton of carbon per hectare annually, more than a regular pasture. So at current rates, that's $12.80. That would be the payoff for doing this for a year per hectare. So why are these cases worth attending to? Well, one is that it's a way of incentivizing the spread of biodiverse, tree-dense landscapes in a context where secondary forests are no longer spreading spontaneously. And furthermore, it engages a group, cattle ranchers, that heretofore basically aren't part of the Red Plus story. So with that, I'll end. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Please take your seats. Put your belts on. So I would like to start, in fact, with the question from the audience. How about that? You have been sitting here, you have been thinking about the questions. There are 5 experts here, and I'm sure that you will have questions for them. So, who's number 1? I can be number 1, but I don't want to be number 1. So, somewhere, yeah, I should jump over this because, no? Okay, yeah.
You want to have a mic?
Thank you so much. I have a bit of a naive question. So given these international agreements and country-level commitments to stopping deforestation or net zero deforestation, the Paris Agreement, the 2020 agreements, when I go around at least most neotropical countries, I don't see a lot of native viveros or greenhouses. And if we really are going to go to something that is going to be a more active reforestation, do you feel like that sector needs to be developed sort of in tandem with a policy solution as well? Or, and what efforts already exist to do that? I just don't know very much about it.
So, active reforestation. Who? Okay, they all want. That's good, eh? That's good. So, Bernardo.
Yeah, but just briefly, please compliment for the experts. But just briefly in terms of, in Brazil's case, for example, where we promised 12 million hectares of restoration in the Paris Agreement, the National Restoration Plan that I alluded to has 8 strategies. Strategy number 1 is support to viveiros and seeds and seedlings production. So that's one of the core 8 strategies of the plan in Brazil. Of course, it just started, so it's a long way to go. But I would like to also point out that another strategy, a key strategy, is spatial prioritization, and in there, finding the role for natural regeneration. So both in order to diminish overall costs of implementing all that, but also to increase many of the benefits that natural regeneration can bring, is also a core part of this strategy. And I think they're both going to be needed.
So outside of Brazil, one of the main problems has been that the forestry sector has been focused on a very small number of mostly exotic tree species, and they are often the ones that the government turns to. Oh, well, we've got to do this restoration now. Tell us what to do. And, you know, they don't have a lot of tools in their toolbox. So there are some small projects, but this has to be accelerated, following the example of Brazil, bringing in the private sector, creating an industry, essentially, for producing native tree seedlings, transport, lots of jobs. It's really been a revolution in the Atlantic forest, and I think it's a model that there's no reason why other countries can't begin to follow that.
So, I mean, I really share your concern. I guess that's why I'm saying that it strikes me that we really need to work on ways to incentivize people who are landholders, small landholders, to participate in reforestation. It's a difficult task, and I, like you, don't see it happening on the ground, at least in the places I work.
So reforestation is an NGO business and it should be a private company business more and more. That's what you're saying. Okay. So other questions or comments to this question, or I do not agree with this one. That's fine. I can't see.
Hello.
So,
Hi.
so people
I
should
have a
bring you.
question. Some of you mentioned that secondary forests are not all the same, so they might have different ecological quality or integrity or capacities to regenerate. So how do you see integrating that in the policy? So are we going to conserve or pay for ecosystem services for any type of natural regeneration, or can we distinguish the quality of this regeneration? I don't know to whom.
Thanks for the question. I think I sort of put that in my slide, that we need to disaggregate exactly what do we mean, or what type of secondary forest we want to maintain. So along the lines of what Bernardo said, a prioritization exercise is a must. I mean, where do you think that this patch of secondary forest is going to last longer? That's, it's in a very steep slope where no little pressure for agriculture or conversion, or else prone to a given, PES scheme. It all depends. Whereas you have secondary forests, which are part of the human life cycle, okay? And, they grow and they are cut, and they grow and they're cut. So what do you do there? I mean, do you call them, do we incorporate them as a component of a national restoration strategy? That's for governments to decide. But to me, the key issue that really is needed to decide where do you go is, it has to do a lot with how different sectors see the resources, and that's exactly the problem I see in many countries, that secondary forest as a whole, it's orphaned. I mean, the environment likes it at times. In other countries, they don't pay attention. Foresters are ill-trained to see these as a production system. They see it as a idle land. So there are a lot of cross-sectoral divorces, and that goes also to the extent of forestry schools not really teaching what exactly is needed to maintain that resource. So I go back to the curricular part, which is, in my opinion, something that really needs to be developed. It's a unique resource, and probably doesn't even need to be named secondary forest. So there's a paper that came out in 2005 who suggested, let's call them domestic forests. The word secondary is like the word degradation. I mean, secondary means a lot to a farmer and doesn't mean a lot to a technocrat in the capital. So I think, in a way, terminology matters. So to wrap up, the need to disaggregate the resource in the context of decision making, it's critical. And that said, and as I mentioned in my slide, it's a type of resource that really needs multi-stakeholder dialogue, and needs to move away from a technocratic definition of what a secondary forest is or not, and to that, that said, it has to focus on, who really benefits from that type of resource. If it has a 5 to 10, rotation cycle, so be it. But give it a legitimate purpose, and not override it with laws and regulations that most of the time disregard the views of the local needs. And that has a lot to do with the person who governs that in my opinion, forestry is still very orthodox, and that type of resource, it's not taught in the way that it's being taught, and it's the field of agronomists, and that type of cross-fertilization, in my opinion, is essential to really, create a typology where the right intervention can, be most effective.
Okay, thank you. That's a clear message. So, who? I see a hand waving there, and there's another one waving there, there's another one waving there. And that one is with the microphone, that's good.
Hi. You mentioned giving private initiatives, like giving to NGO the possibilities to deal with the problem if governmental initiatives weren't successful. And I see some misuse of those initiatives. For example, eucalyptus plantation developing in areas and benefiting from the help from, for example, the Red++. I've seen this in Peru where I'm working, where people actually are even deforesting some areas or not leaving area that could actually regenerate pretty quickly, and they plant a lot of eucalyptus because they can receive help for doing this, and because also it's the cheaper way rather than putting native species, which is much more expensive. So how do we guide the process? How do we improve NGOs? How do we create NGOs guidances?
Okay, thank you. I think that's related to your earlier answer on this private company and the availability of new sons. So please comment on that.
Yeah, I think as the restoration movement is growing, there are some really exciting initiatives like the 20 by 20 initiative, and through that there are capacity building programs, and there are groups that are writing good practices and standards for restoration, and really providing a lot more rich information to policymakers and to the agencies and NGOs within the country that are active in the restoration area. So there's a lot of technical support for this, where this same initiative is also going on in Africa with the Africa 100, and it's a slow process. Because they're very entrenched ideas about how you plant trees and how you reforest, and there's even a lack of understanding about what's the difference between reforestation and restoration, and even what is natural regeneration. A lot of people don't even realize that that's an option. So there's still a lot of a huge need for education at all of these levels, but those things are starting to happen.
Thank you very much. Marielle, yeah? No?
Yep.
Just
Hi.
thought.
This question is for Bernardo. So in your multi-criteria diagram, what was the climate change target that you were sort of optimizing for? What was the? I was wondering what the climate change target was that your analysis was optimizing for.
Thank you. Actually, what we're doing there is for each of those three initial solutions, we actually in all of them we're allocating 5.2 million hectares of restoration, which is estimated to be the legal deficit in the Atlantic rainforest. So what we did that for biodiversity, we had a spatial prioritization algorithm based on linear programming, and the idea was to minimize species extinctions for biodiversity, to maximize carbon sequestration. So basically we have a layer that was based actually in the work of many of you in the panel published in Nature last year, which is a layer of the potential sequestration of secondary forests. So that's the layer we used, and we simply allocated the 5.2 million hectares in the areas that would maximize. So we didn't have a fixed target to achieve a climate restoration, we had an area target. And we achieved 1.4 billion tons of CO2 sequestration with that allocation.
Okay, thanks.
That sounds a lot to me.
Thank you. I have a question. Maybe I should say, we'll start sharing my concern. There is a lot of, all these different countries have said, well, we will do X million of hectares to restoration. So restoration probably will not happen in the most productive agricultural, in the most productive areas, because those are the ones that probably people want to keep for agriculture or for cattle production and so on. So my concern is, and that's what I would like to know your perspective and if you share that concern or not, what are the chances that these restoration efforts will happen in naturally non-forested vegetation types, let's say natural savannas, cerrado vegetation, wetlands, and I'm really concerned that those are going to be the areas that want to be restored when actually they, I mean, and you, Bernardo, showed that those are the areas that actually may have a other sort of biodiversity value. So I would like to hear your opinion about that.
Very good question. So who wants to question? Don't restore in the wrong areas. That's the message. And what is your experience with that?
Well, I think that there needs to be a lot of guidance in terms of if you are going to join the bond challenge or you know have a restoration commitment in your country. That means that there are certain criteria and guidelines that need to be considered. Now, the problem is that the countries do what the countries do, and that can't be controlled by anybody. So this has to be done with a process to explain and to get their understanding, and people within the country to lobby very strongly that these considerations are very important and to explain why. And you've got to get everybody on board to support that.
So then my question to you is to come to this one. What are we doing to make this happen? And so you have 10 seconds to think about it. You go and answer on this one.
Well,
so give an example.
In answer to the question about NGOs back here, and your question as well, one of the crucial things is creating fora within which NGOs and country groups can come together and compare standards. But what's a country-appropriate plan look like? That would be appropriate to your question. But with NGOs, it's like what kind of action plan worked, and what a prototype or pilot project worked, and what does that suggest about what we do in my country? So part of the key thing here is creating these fora within which people can negotiate strategies and come up with standards.
Okay, thank you. Some practical things that we are doing. Yes.
Thanks, Marielos, for the question. And I'm going to give you a very country-specific example. You know, if you go to the highlands of Peru, where there's no above the tree line, the amount of eucalypts being planted, it's incredible, for the sole reason of fuel wood for local communities. So you're replacing a native ecosystem by another one, right? So that's exactly your question. How do we avoid that? But this has been going on since the late 1800s. Because there's a lot of people living in the Peruvian highlands. Now, if Peru commits to restore X amount of hectares or millions of hectares, maybe they'll keep doing that. Maybe they'll keep replacing the Páramo or the Puna by Eucalyptus de glupta. So it's a political decision in a way, but I don't think from a social standpoint the native population, the local communities will keep planting eucalypts because that's the cheapest source of fuel wood. So it's a tricky question. I don't think there's a single answer. There's very context specific. I'm not advocating replacing native grasslands with pines, but there's at least 2 centuries of history of planting eucalypts above the tree line in Peru and probably in Bolivia as well.
Yeah. And you want to comment on this one? Yeah,
well, I was thinking that it's happening. I know it's happening, but it's not at the scale that we are talking about at this moment. I mean, there are small patches of eucalyptus around communities or some hectares around. But the scale that we are talking about at this moment is huge.
Well, I can say that in Peru it's huge. Okay.
Well, but
it has a historical reason.
Huge, yeah? It's huge. And in several areas it's huge. Yeah? Huge. So other questions? You're all tired, or? Yeah? Hey, I see a question there. Is this the final thing, including the questions? Okay. So the last question, please.
Here, I have the microphone here.
Somebody, I can't see you, so it's the lights.
Yeah, just in the same topic about restoration. I think restoration goes beyond to increase tree cover, because we are speaking about restore processes. So in a landscape scale, if you can increase tree cover in some places, you can also speak about restore some processes and scale more big. So it's beyond that, just increase tree cover, just to clarify that.
So somebody wants to answer this? No? No question, was mere a comment?
Well, I guess I would, let me try to.
Yeah, go on.
So my own sense is that you're right, that there needs to be a procedure, a process-oriented kind of reform to go with the outcome-oriented sort of reforms. The thing one has to accept when that is that this means more autonomy for locales in terms of the kinds of land cover that results. And it may not always be as was intimated by this conversation about eucalypts in Peru, it may not always be something that seems ecologically sensitive.
All right, thank you. I'm sorry. By now we first have to answer this, luckily, one question. So get your phones, because we need this question to answer, and that's... Was this one? Yes. So this was the one we answered. Should secondary forest fragments be protected as conservation areas in regions with low forest cover? Oh, I lost the 20% of the no ones. Okay. Yeah, good. No, good. Oh, I love you. So we don't have a second question, so there is still time. But meanwhile, I would give the floor, because he wanted to say something on this last one.
Actually, I just wanted to do what you asked for us to answer, what we are doing about it.
Yes, okay, that's a good one. So
together with the answer for that question, if you...
So my question was, what are you doing? Can you give an example of the last 10 years, what you do that really has made an impact? You're going to tell.
Okay, I don't know about the impact bit, but...
No, I want to know about the impact. So, try to get there.
Answering about your concern, which is a real concern, in the National Restoration Plan in Brazil, we're very clear that we're talking about the recuperation of native vegetation. So we actually have targets for all different biomes of Brazil, and the only thing that can count towards that target is if you restore the native vegetation of that given biome. And we worked through that. We also worked for 10 years under an FCCC on the biodiversity safeguards for RED. And one of the things we strived a lot to include in that is that you get no credits for planting exotic species in an area that was not a forest before. So if you plant eucalyptus in the Cerrado, you're not going to get RED credits. So if, and I think both comments are right, people will be doing that. But what we can't do is to make the problem worse by giving additional incentives that were not there before through these restoration targets.
Okay, thank you very much. Meanwhile, these magic guys put up this question, and this was the other question, and you're doing what you should be doing, and that is voting, or saying what you think. So there is like socioeconomic aspects is more important than biophysical aspects. That's what the majority says now. Meanwhile, I will try to wrap up and give like punchlines for each one of them. Robin says forests recover well, and it depends on many aspects. So all these aspects that she mentioned matters. Everything matters, and I think that's a good message. It's much more complicated than we think normally, and that is important is to what do you compare it, to all growth forests or to all the alternatives. That's a very good point. Manuel, he says secondary forest is always part of SES, so socio-ecological systems. Everything needs to be more integrated from plans and from all scales, from the national scales to the local scales, and he wants to look at impact at all levels. Laura says we need more local estimates on regrowth. to be able to make these carbon estimations. And carbon is still easy things that we do. So let alone that we start looking at all the other aspects that are even much more complicated. We have to look at the spatial configuration, and it is a premise to do or start long-term studies. And I personally would like to get their long-term involvement. I would like to add it, but that's, and I'm very happy that she is working in Yucatan, so this is about the area where we are right now. Bernardo, he says, and he agrees with Manuel, and of course other ones maybe also agree, but he agrees explicitly with Manuel. He says we need to think in terms of socio-ecological systems. So forget about all the other things, that's past. From now on, it's socio-ecological systems, and now we can move forward. And he introduces, to me at least, this term. It's all about interactive, complex, adaptive systems. Yeah? You got that? Okay. Interactive, complex, adaptive systems. The other thing is resilience, and he says resilience is a very important concept that is well developed, reasonably well developed in ecology. It's not so well developed yet in social sciences, and that should be more integrated, and that's the other point. And the next point I would like to mention is the spillover effects. So you do something here and it has effects somewhere else, and he gave a very nice example of that. Tom, he is changing our minds again. Not only the forest transformation, but now he says, well, everybody now agrees that secondary forest is becoming more or increasing, etc. But I find that this is declining now. So the increase is declining. We are somewhere on a plateau, and in some areas it's going back. It's not increasing anymore. So the future is not as bright as we thought maybe 10, 15 years ago. Yeah, he will put this more nuanced, of course.
Except that what this implies is that we need more of a public sector effort to make this happen.
More public sector effort, and one of the reasons is slower urban migration. So should we move more to the cities now?
No,
okay, that's not the implication.
Organize smallholders so they can participate.
Yeah, and he said we need more ways to stimulate it, and PES is one of the ways, but there has many complexities, and there are several other ones that are mentioned later on. But our time is up. So, and wow, 80. Okay, so wow, yes, people say a bit more than before, but maybe this is within the statistical band limits. So I would not put that. So this is the first question. The second question. Before, and that this was my error, my problem, so I'm very sorry, but I'm so happy to see that. Am I happy with this? One final comment. So who is happy or not happy with this result? Please, comment. Happy? You're happy? Oh, okay. So we should do more on the socioeconomic aspects to be able to make an impact. That's what Tom also said. So I would like to thank the panelists very much for their contribution, and I would like to thank the audience very much, all of you, for your interesting questions and their responses. And I think it's about 6:30 or, yeah, something? So with this, thank you all very much. See you back tomorrow at 9. Have a nice evening. Explore downtown Mérida, don't forget it. Yes? Okay. See you. Thank you very much.